She arrived with nothing but a basket of seeds and old recipes nobody wanted. By February, those seeds and recipes were the only thing standing between 400 people and a grave. Briar Ridge, Nebraska. Winter of 1888. A mail-order bride named Evelyn Mercer stepped off a wagon into a world that had already decided she didn't matter. Her husband barely looked at her. The town barely noticed her. She was just another woman brought west to cook and keep quiet. But while everyone else was watching the sky for trouble, Evelyn was watching the ground. And she was preparing. This is her story. If it moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon hit a frozen rut 3 miles outside Briar Ridge, and Evelyn Mercer grabbed the sideboard hard enough to split a fingernail down to the quick. She didn't cry out. She pressed her thumb against her palm, breathed through her nose, and watched the Nebraska sky go gray and enormous above her. It was the 3rd week of November, 1888, and the temperature had been dropping since she crossed into the territory 4 days ago. The man driving the wagon, a hired hand named Deke, who worked the livery stable in the nearest real town, which was still 40 miles east, hadn't said more than 6 words to her since they left. He had a wool scarf pulled up over his nose, and he drove with his shoulders hunched like a man bracing for a punch he knew was coming. Evelyn understood that posture. She'd worn it herself for most of the past year. She was 26 years old, and she had come to Nebraska because she'd run out of other options. That was the plain truth of it, and she'd stopped dressing it up in prettier language somewhere around the Kansas border. Her mother had died in the spring. The house in Ohio had gone to pay debts. Her older brother had a wife who made it clear there wasn't room, and her younger brother was 17 and couldn't barely feed himself. She had $20, a trunk, 2 good hands, and a letter from a man named Jonah Mercer who had written that he needed a capable woman and that he had 160 acres and a sound house. The letter had been polite, careful. It told her almost nothing about the man who wrote it, which in her experience meant either he was private by nature or there was something he didn't want her to know before she was already too far away to turn around. She'd been corresponding with Jonah Mercer for 4 months through a marriage broker out of Chicago. His letters were short, practical. He asked whether she could preserve meat, whether she knew how to work a root cellar, whether she had any experience with livestock. She'd answered honestly, yes, yes, and some. She did not tell him that she'd been managing her mother's household since she was 14, that she could stretch a half bushel of dried beans into 2 weeks of meals for 4 people, that she had notebooks full of her grandmother's remedies and recipes going back to before the war. She figured she'd let him discover those things for himself. His last letter, written 3 weeks before her arrival, had said, "I will have Deke meet you at the Callaway station. He'll know who you are." That was it. No welcome, no warmth, just logistics. Deke pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a house that was better than she'd expected, and worse than she'd hoped. It was a soddy with a wood frame addition built onto the east side. The newer part had real glass in the windows, which meant Jonah Mercer had some ambition, or had at one point. The yard was clean. The fence posts were straight. A barn sat maybe 60 yards back, its doors shut against the wind. A man came out of the house when he heard the wagon. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a beard that needed trimming. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years either side. He walked like someone who'd spent a long time moving through difficult terrain. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at her. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. The step was icy, and she nearly went down, caught herself on the wheel, kept her face neutral, and walked toward him across the frozen ground. "Jonah Mercer?" she said. "That's right." He had a voice like something that had been left out in the weather. "You're Evelyn." "I am." They looked at each other for a moment. There was no romance in it. It was closer to 2 people sizing up a piece of property they'd agreed to buy sight unseen, each of them quietly calculating whether they'd been deceived. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "You're quieter than I expected," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, just an acknowledgement that she'd answered. "Deke'll get your trunk," he said. "Come inside." What? The inside of the house was warm, which she was grateful for, and sparse, which she'd expected. A table, 4 chairs, a cast iron stove that was working hard, a shelf of books, 2 oil lamps. The walls of the older soddy portion were hung with oilcloth to keep the dirt from crumbling, and the floor there was packed earth. The wood frame room had plank floors and a proper ceiling. There was a bedroom off the main room and a narrow loft above reached by a ladder. Evelyn set her bag on the table and started taking off her coat. "I've got salt pork and cornbread," Jonah said. He was at the stove, not looking at her. "It's not much, but it's hot." "That's fine," she said. "I don't cook much beyond the basics. Never saw the point in fussing." She looked at the back of his neck and thought, there it is. "What do you consider fussing?" she asked. He turned and looked at her like he was surprised she'd pushed on it. "Spending 3 hours making something that's done in 20 minutes and tastes about the same." "Food doesn't taste the same," she said, keeping her voice even. "The way something's made changes what it does to you." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. He put the cornbread on the table and ladled out 2 bowls of salt pork, and she sat down and ate and looked around the room and started making a list in her head. The cellar door was beside the stove. She'd check it tomorrow. She'd seen a kitchen garden gone to frost outside the window. She'd want to know what he'd put up and what he hadn't. The woodpile was decent, but not deep enough for a hard winter. She'd need to say something about that carefully because he didn't look like a man who took direction easily. She was here. She'd made her choice. Now she had to make it work. But Jonah Mercer was not a cruel man. That was the first thing she learned, and it mattered. He wasn't warm either, not in any way she'd been used to, but he wasn't mean. He was the kind of person who had lived alone a long time and had organized his entire life around efficiency and quiet, and her presence disrupted both of those things in ways she could see he was trying to tolerate. He woke before dawn every day and was in the barn before she'd gotten the stove going. He came in for meals, ate whatever was in front of him without comment, and went back out. In the evenings, he read or did accounts or sharpened tools. He spoke when he had something to say and didn't when he didn't. She had grown up in a house full of noise and people, and she found his silences strange at first and then, gradually, something she could work in. She used the silences to think, to plan. The cellar was the first thing she'd assessed after she'd settled in, and what she found there worried her more than she let on. Jonah had put up some things. 2 barrels of salted beef, a crate of turnips going soft at the edges, some dried corn, a small store of flour and dried beans. It was enough for one person to get through winter without starving. For 2 people, it would be tight. And Jonah had the appetite of a man doing hard physical labor from 4 in the morning until dark, which meant he ate considerably more than one ordinary person. She didn't say this to him directly. She'd learned early that telling Jonah Mercer he'd done something wrong was like pushing on a fence post. It didn't move. It just made her look foolish for trying. She worked around him instead. She started in November, the day after she arrived. There wasn't much left to harvest from the kitchen garden, but she'd checked everything anyway, pulling up root vegetables that had been left in the ground, cutting the last of the dried seed pods for seeds she'd plant in spring. She went through the surrounding scrubland with a basket and collected dried rose hips and the last of the wild onions and a clutch of dried cattail heads that most people didn't know you could use, but her grandmother had shown her. She pickled what she could. She dried what she couldn't pickle. She rendered fat from the kitchen scraps and stored it in crocks. She made a stock from beef bones that Jonah had been throwing to the dog, letting it reduce down until it was nearly solid, then storing it in the cold cellar where it would keep for months and could be dissolved into hot water to make broth that had real nutrition in it. Jonah watched this with the particular expression of a man who thought something was unnecessary but couldn't quite articulate why without sounding unreasonable. "You know we have enough food," he said one evening, watching her core and dry apple rings by the stove. She'd traded 2 jars of pickled beets to the widow Halbrook down the road for a bushel of apples, because the widow's tree had produced more than she could use. "Do we?" Evelyn said. "I've wintered here 7 years. I know how much food we need." "You've wintered alone," she said, "and you've had one body's luck each time. You don't know which winter's going to be the bad one until you're already in it." He was quiet for a moment. "There's such a thing as too much worry. And there's such a thing as not enough preparation," she said pleasantly. "One of us will be right in February. I hope it's you." He made that sound again, the not-quite dismissal, and went back to his book. She hung the apple rings on a string above the stove and started on the next batch. Chum. The town of Briar Ridge was small enough that Evelyn had met most of its population within her first 2 weeks, mostly because she made a point of it. She walked the 3/4 of a mile to the general store twice a week, and she paid attention to what she saw. She saw a town that was not ready for a bad winter. It wasn't that people were careless exactly. It was more that the summer had been decent, the fall harvest reasonable, and people had convinced themselves that would continue. The Garrity family, 5 children, a husband with a bad back, a wife who was 7 months pregnant, had a root cellar that was half full at best. The Collins family, who ran the livery stable, had put up plenty of feed for their horses, but not enough food for the 4 teenagers living in their house. Old Margaret Sauer, who was 72 and lived alone in a house that smelled of wood smoke and lavender, had some dried herbs and some flour and not much else. She couldn't say any of this to them. She'd been in town 3 weeks. She wasn't nobody's mother. What she could do was ask questions. She learned who had a surplus of what. She made small trades. She mentioned casually to anyone who would listen that she was happy to share her pickling recipes if they had vegetables going to waste. 2 families took her up on it. She spent an afternoon at the Hallbrook place and another afternoon with the Garrity wife, Clara, who was exhausted and grateful for the company and the help. She was building something, though she couldn't have named it clearly yet. She was building a web of small connections and small kindnesses, the kind that don't look like much until suddenly they're the only thing holding everything together. The first real snow came the second week of December, and it was serious. Not a blizzard, not yet, but a heavy, determined snowfall that lasted 4 days and left 18 inches on the ground and a sky that looked like it was thinking about going again. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero, and the wind came off the plains with nothing to stop it for 100 miles. Jonah spent those 4 days doing what he always did in snowstorms. He kept the livestock alive, he kept the stove fed. He moved at the steady, unremarkable pace of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. He didn't seem frightened. He didn't seem worried. He seemed, if anything, slightly annoyed at the inconvenience. Evelyn spent those 4 days in the kitchen. She'd been in the cellar before the snow started, and she'd done the math again, and it still came up short for a hard winter with 2 people. So she started in on the less obvious stores. She made a long, slow beef broth using bones she'd been saving, adding dried onion and rose hips and some herbs from the bundle she'd brought from Ohio. She reduced it way down, let it cool to a solid, wrapped it in cloth, and packed it in the cold cellar. 1 small cup of that dissolved in hot water would give you more than you'd get from a regular bowl of soup, and it kept for months. She made hardtack, not the terrible kind that tasted like nothing, but a version with dried herbs and a bit of rendered fat worked in that was almost good. She dried more apple rings. She pickled the rest of the winter beets. She found herself thinking about the Garrity children. Claire Garrity's baby was due in January. A newborn needed a mother who was healthy and fed, and Clara had looked thin and tired the last time Evelyn had seen her. She put aside a small store, a jar of the concentrated broth, 2 jars of pickled vegetables, a small cloth of dried herbs, for the Garrity family, for after the baby came. She told herself she wasn't worried, but she was. She met Wyatt Collins by accident in the first week of January. He was the oldest of the Collins boys, 17, nearly 6 feet, with ears that stuck out and hands that were already big as dinner plates. He came by the homestead on his way back from town because his horse had thrown a shoe on the icy road, and Jonah was the closest neighbor with a forge. Jonah fixed the shoe. Evelyn fed the boy. She put a bowl of beef and vegetable soup in front of him and watched him eat it the way only a teenager who's been cold and hungry for hours can eat, head down, both hands around the bowl, not breathing between spoonfuls. When he came up for air, he said, "Ma'am, that's the best thing I've eaten since October." "Your mother's cooking has gone downhill," she said. He flushed red. "No, ma'am, it's just, we don't have much variety right now, mostly beans and cornmeal." She looked at him and thought about the Collins household. 4 teenagers and 2 adults in a livery stable that ate money in the winter when people weren't traveling. "Are you in town most days?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I help at the stable and I run errands for Doc Yates sometimes." "Dr. Yates," she said. "He's the only doctor in the county?" "Yes, ma'am. Has been for years. He's a good one, too." Wyatt looked up at her, a little uncertain. "You're not feeling poorly, are you?" "No," she said. "Not yet." She sent him home with 2 jars from the cellar, pickled beets and a small container of the concentrated broth, with instructions on how to dissolve it. She told him to give it to his mother and say it was extra and she didn't need it. Jonah, who had come in from the barn in time to see this, watched her from the doorway with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the look of a man recalculating something. "You gave away our stores," he said, when Wyatt had gone. "A small amount," she said. "We can spare it." For how long are we going to be able to spare it? She looked at him steadily. Longer than I thought, if I'm careful. I've been careful. He looked at the cellar door and then back at her. For a moment, she thought he was going to push it further, make it into an argument, draw a line. Instead, he said, I'll cut more wood tomorrow. We've got 2 good trees down in the east lot that need splitting. It wasn't an apology. It was an agreement, but it was something. The fever started the 2nd week of January, and by the end of the month, it had worked through half the town. It began with the Paulson family, 4 kids and a father who was already not well, and then moved with the patient efficiency of illness through the close quarters of a small winter town. Within 10 days, the Garrity's had it. Then the school teacher, a young man from Illinois named Alderman, who had come west full of enthusiasm and was now discovering the frontier's other qualities. Then 3 more families in quick succession. Doc Yates was running himself ragged, going house to house on roads that were packed ice, treating the fever with what he had, which wasn't much. The illness itself was survivable for most people. It burned hot for several days and then broke, leaving the patient wrung out and weak. The problem was what came after. People who'd been sick for a week weren't eating. Families that hadn't been eating well to start with now had members who'd sweated through their stores and were too weak to cook for themselves. Evelyn learned all of this from Wyatt Collins, who was the best source of information in Briar Ridge, because his errands for Doc Yates took him to every house in town. The Paulson kids are better from the fever, he told her one afternoon, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands. But Mr. Paulson says they're not eating, they don't have an appetite, and they're weak, and their stores were already not— He stopped himself. They were already low. Evelyn was already reaching for the shelf. She can't go to sick houses, Jonah said. He was at the table, and his voice was careful and deliberate. She'll bring it back here. I know, Evelyn said. Then what are you doing? She turned and looked at him. I'm not going anywhere. Wyatt is. Wyatt blinked. Ma'am, you already go to every house in town. You've probably been exposed to everything there is to be exposed to by now. She was already thinking through it as she talked. I'll make broth, soup, things that are easy for sick people to eat that will help them get their strength back. You'll take it to them. That's— Wyatt stopped. That's a lot of work for you. Yes, she agreed. And your supplies, he started. Are my business, she said. Will you do it? He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was too old for 17. Then he said, Yes, ma'am. I'll do it. Jonah said nothing. But he didn't say no, and at that point, that was enough. Matem. She started with the Paulsons. She made a broth from the concentrated stock she'd prepared, adding dried onion and the wild herbs she'd collected in the fall. Not because they were medicine exactly, but because they were good for the digestion and added something that plain broth didn't have. She added a small amount of fat for calories because sick people needed more than they thought. She strained it carefully and put it in a covered jar, wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. Tell Mrs. Paulson to give them a small cup every few hours, she told Wyatt. Don't let them try to eat solid food yet if they can't face it. The broth is enough for now. And tell her to keep them warm. Wyatt set off on horseback, the jar tucked inside his coat against his chest. She started another pot. By the end of that first week, she had established something that worked like a small, informal system. Wyatt came every morning and every afternoon. She sent him out with whatever she'd made, soup, broth, sometimes a loaf of bread that was dense with dried fruit and fat, and would give a weak person calories they'd actually absorb. He reported back on who was improving, who needed more, who was newly sick. The Paulson children had turned a corner. Mrs. Paulson sent back an empty jar and a note in shaky handwriting that said, Mrs. Mercer, I don't know who to thank. The Garrity baby had been born, a girl, healthy, Clara thin but all right, and Clara had sent word that the broth was the only thing she could keep down in the first days after the birth. Then the school teacher Alderman had recovered enough to eat and had told half the town that the soup from the Mercer woman had pulled him through, and then Doc Yates himself had come to the homestead. He was a small man, Dr. Solomon Yates, shorter than Evelyn, which she hadn't expected, with wire-rimmed glasses and a face that looked like it had been carved by years of other people's worry. He was exhausted in the way that goes beyond sleep, the way that gets into a person's bones and sits there. He took his hat off at her door and said, Mrs. Mercer, I owe you an apology. She blinked. For what? For not thinking of this myself. He gestured vaguely at her kitchen, the pots on the stove, the jars lined up on the shelf. I've been treating the fever. I haven't been thinking enough about what comes after the fever. What you're doing. He paused, assembling the words carefully. It's not medicine, strictly speaking, but it's doing what medicine can't do right now. She felt something warm and uncomfortable in her chest, the feeling of being seen at something you'd been doing quietly and alone. It's just cooking, she said. It is not just cooking, he said, firmly and without drama. It's the difference between a body that recovers and a body that doesn't. Calories, warmth, something that tastes like something. He looked at her with direct, tired eyes. I'm going to start directing families to you, if you're willing. I'm willing, she said. He nodded once, like that was settled, and put his hat back on. Then he stopped at the door and turned back. How are your stores holding up? He asked. She paused one beat too long. We're managing, she said. He looked at her steadily in a way that told her he was a man accustomed to reading what people weren't saying. He didn't push it, but his expression, as he walked back out into the cold, was one of careful concern. Jonah was at the table when she came back inside, and he'd clearly been close enough to the door to hear at least part of it. Doc Yates thinks you're running a hospital, he said. Doc Yates thinks I'm doing something useful, she said. She sat down across from him. Her back hurt and her hands were cracked from the cold water she'd been working with all day, and she was tired in a way that went down to something deep. Jonah looked at her across the table. His face was hard to read, and it was always hard to read, but she was getting better at it, slowly. She could see something working in him. Show me, he said. She looked at him. Show you what? The cellar. What we have. What we've used. He met her eyes. I've been letting you manage it because you're better at it than I am, but I should know where we stand. So she showed him. She lit a lamp and they went down the cellar steps together, and she pointed out what was there, what was not there, what she'd been sending out, and what she'd kept back. She showed him the careful marks she'd made on the shelves, tracking what came in and what went out. She showed him the concentrated broth, how much was left, how far it could stretch. He stood in the lamplight and looked at it all for a long moment. You've been feeding half the county, he said. A portion of it, she said, and keeping us alive at the same time. Trying to. He picked up one of the jars, pickled turnips with dill she'd dried herself, and turned it in his hands, looking at the color of it in the yellow light. My first wife, he said, and then stopped. She waited. She didn't last the first winter, he said. 1881. I wasn't. He stopped again, set the jar back down. I was efficient. I had what I thought was enough. I was wrong about several things. He said it simply, without drama, which somehow made it worse to hear. She said, I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He looked at her. What you're doing, I didn't understand it. I still don't understand all of it, but I can see what it's doing. It was not a declaration. It was not romantic. It was a man who had miscalculated once, badly, telling her that he was paying attention now. We need more wood, she said, because that was the practical thing that came next. If we're going to keep the kitchen going at this level, we'll go through it faster than I planned. I'll cut it tomorrow, he said, and the day after. I'll cut as much as you need. They went back upstairs, and Evelyn put another pot on the stove, and the snow came down outside, steady and indifferent and vast. By the first week of February, she was down to her last deep stores. She knew it was coming. She'd been watching the numbers in her head for weeks, the quiet arithmetic of survival. What goes out, what comes in, what's left, how long. She'd been as careful as a person could be, and she'd stretched things further than she'd thought possible, but there was a bottom to every cellar, and she was close to it. She didn't tell Wyatt. She didn't tell Doc Yates. She kept sending the jars out because she didn't know how to stop, because stopping felt like choosing which family would go without, and she couldn't make that calculation. Jonah knew. He'd been in the cellar himself. He could see the shelves thinning. He hadn't said anything yet, but she could feel it gathering in him, the way a storm gathers before it breaks. She was standing at the stove one evening, stirring the last of the larger batch of broth, and the snow was coming down again outside, and she was doing the arithmetic in her head one more time, and the numbers still came up the same. She thought about Clara Garrity's baby girl, 3 weeks old and warm in her mother's arms. She thought about the Paulson children running across their yard, which Wyatt had mentioned seeing yesterday. She thought about the schoolteacher Alderman, who had apparently started teaching again from his sickbed, writing lessons on a slate and sending them home with students who came to his door. She thought about her grandmother, who had fed people through hard times her whole life, and never once made it seem like heroism. It was just what you did. It was just what you were for. The stove popped and settled, the snow fell, the broth simmered, and Evelyn Mercer stirred the pot and kept thinking, kept calculating, kept looking for the answer that wasn't quite there yet, but had to be somewhere, because the people who needed her couldn't afford for there not to be one. The answer came to her at 3 in the morning, the way most answers did. Not as a sudden bright thing, but as a slow settling, like silt dropping to the bottom of a glass of water. She'd been lying awake in the dark, listening to Jonah breathe on the other side of the bed. He slept the way he did everything else, efficiently, without fuss. She'd been staring at the ceiling and running the numbers again, the same numbers that kept coming up short. And somewhere in the 4th or 5th time through the arithmetic, she stopped thinking about what she had and started thinking about what she knew. She knew the Halbrook widow had a root cellar with more dried corn than one old woman could eat before April. She knew the Garrity's had a milk cow that was still producing, barely, and Clara had mentioned that the baby wasn't taking to nursing well and they had more milk than they could use. She knew the Collins family had 4 sacks of dried beans they'd bought in bulk last summer because the price had been good, more than a family of 6 needed even in a hard winter. Nobody was sharing. Not because they were selfish. These weren't selfish people. It was because everybody was scared, and scared people hold tighter to what they have, even when holding tight is the wrong answer. She understood that. She'd been doing it herself, in her way. She sat up in bed at 4 in the morning and went to the kitchen and started writing a list by lamplight. And when Jonah came in at 5:30 from the barn, he found her still at the table with a lamp burning low and paper covered in her small, careful handwriting. He looked at the paper, then at her, then at the dark circles under her eyes. "Did you sleep?" "Some," she said, which was not quite a lie. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd kept warm, sat down across from her and waited. He'd gotten better at waiting, she'd noticed, or maybe she'd gotten better at seeing it. "I've been thinking about the stores wrong," she said. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "How so?" "I've been thinking about what I have, what we have. Like there's a wall between our cellar and everyone else's." She tapped the list with her pencil. "But there isn't a wall. Or there doesn't have to be one." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to ask people for food. I want to ask people to share what they can spare. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she said patiently. "Asking for charity it puts people in a bad position. It makes the person giving feel powerful, and the person receiving feel small. What I'm thinking is different. It's more like pooling. Everyone puts in what they have too much of. Everyone takes out what they need. Nobody's the charity case, and nobody's the benefactor." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression he got when he was working through something he wasn't sure he agreed with. People are scared of their own supplies running out. They're not going to be easy to convince. "I know," she said. "That's the hard part. Who's going to organize it?" She looked at him. He set down his cup. "Ah," he said. She talked to Wyatt first because Wyatt was young enough that good ideas still seemed possible to him, and because he knew everyone in Briar Ridge and everyone knew him. He came by that morning with his usual anxious energy, hat in hand, stamping snow off his boots at the door, and she sat him down and told him what she was thinking while she ladled soup into jars. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she'd come to value in him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Mrs. Paulson would do it," he said. "After what you did for her kids, she'd give you her last potato." "I don't want her last potato. I want what people can spare without hurting themselves." "I know. I'm just saying there's goodwill there. More than you might think." He looked up at her. "The thing is, people don't really know what everybody else has. They're all just sitting in their own houses thinking they're the only ones managing." "That's exactly right," she said. "If they knew—" He stopped, working it out. "If they knew that old Mrs. Halbrook has extra corn and the Garrity's have extra milk, they might not feel so alone about it." "Yes," Evelyn said. Wyatt nodded slowly. Then he said, "I can talk to people. I go everywhere anyway. I could—" I don't know, sort of feel out who might be open to it before you make any kind of public, he waved his hand, announcement or whatever. That would be very helpful, she said. He stood up, put his hat on, then stopped. Mrs. Mercer, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why are you doing all this? He wasn't being rude about it. He was genuinely puzzled in the way of someone young who had not yet decided what kind of person he was going to be and was watching other people for information. You've been here 3 months. These aren't your people yet. You're using up your own stores. They're going to be my people, she said. That's the whole point of being here. You don't get a town by just living next to people. You get a town by going through something with them. He looked at her for a moment with that too-old expression that kept showing up on his young face. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and went out into the cold. Doc Yates came by that afternoon. He'd been doing that more regularly now, stopping in on his rounds between houses, less to check on her than to think out loud at someone who wouldn't interrupt him. She'd found she didn't mind. He was a practical man who had seen a lot of human nature, and his company was better than the silence. He sat at her kitchen table with his coat still on. He was always cold, she'd noticed, the kind of thin-blooded man who never quite warmed up in winter, and watched her work while he talked. The alderman boy had a setback, he said. Nothing severe. He pushed himself back to teaching too fast, wore himself back down. I'll send extra broth, she said. The Paulson father is still weak. The fever went, but the cough stayed. He paused. I'm worried about his lungs. She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't much to say. She kept stirring. How are you doing? He asked. Fine. Your stores? She was quiet one beat. Managing. He was quiet too for a moment. Then, I've been a doctor in this county for 11 years. I know what managing means when someone says it in that particular voice. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and direct, no judgment in it. I'm close to the bottom, she said. Not there yet, but I can see it. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. How long? 2 weeks if I'm careful, 3 if I'm very careful and nothing gets worse. And if the sickness flares again? She didn't answer that. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, a gesture she'd noticed he made when he was tired enough that he'd stopped caring how he looked. I've been thinking, he said, that we have a town of people who are all afraid and all managing and none of them talking to each other about it. I've been thinking that too, she said. I talked to Wyatt this morning. He put his glasses back on and looked at her. What are you planning? She told him. He listened the same way Wyatt had, but his responses were different. A doctor's responses. Pragmatic. Looking for the failure points. People won't share if they think they're being asked to give up their safety net, he said. So we have to be specific about what's being asked. Not give what you can. That's too vague. It makes people anxious. I'm thinking more like, if you have more than 8 weeks of a particular thing, share what's above that. Keep your 8-week buffer. Contribute the surplus. He considered this. That's actually quite sensible. The other piece is that it has to go both ways, she said. People who contribute need to know they can take from it too, if they need to. It's not charity, it's a pool. Everyone owns a share of it. Who administers it? She paused. She hadn't fully worked that out. It has to be someone people trust, someone without a stake in any particular family's outcome. They looked at each other. I'm the doctor, he said. I already go into every house. People tell me things they wouldn't tell anyone else. He said it matter-of-factly, not like he was volunteering, but like he was observing a logical conclusion. Would you be willing? She asked. I've been trying to keep this town alive for 11 years, he said. Yes, I'd be willing. The first person Wyatt talked to was Mrs. Halbrook, which turned out to be a stroke of accidental genius on his part, because Margaret Halbrook was 72 years old and had been in Briar Ridge longer than most of the buildings, and when she said something, it carried weight in a way that newer voices didn't. He came back 2 days later looking slightly stunned. She wants to give more than I asked, he said. A lot more. Evelyn looked up from the pot she was tending. How much more? She's got 2 bushels of dried corn she says she'll never use in a winter. She's also got, she showed me her cellar, she's got canned things from the summer that she put up herself, and there's just one of her and she's not going to eat it all. He paused. She also said, he stopped. What? She said she's been lonely. He looked uncomfortable, like this was more personal information than he had expected to come home with. She said she's been sitting in that house for 2 months and not seeing anyone, and she didn't know the town was in trouble because nobody came to tell her. Evelyn thought about that for a moment. So part of what people need isn't just food. I think so, yeah. She made a note in her head. It wasn't just about the cellars, it was about the isolation. People sealed into their houses by cold and fear and illness, each one thinking they were the only one struggling. She sent Wyatt back to Mrs. Halbrook with a jar of broth and a standing invitation to come to the Mercer homestead on any day she could manage the walk. Then she sent him to the Collins family and the Garrity's and 2 other households she'd identified as having probable surplus. The responses were not uniform. The Collins patriarch, a careful, suspicious man named Harold, who had built his livery stable on the principle that no debt should go unrecorded, said he'd think about it and got back to Wyatt 3 days later with a list of exactly what he was willing to contribute and what he expected in return. It was transactional in a way that made Evelyn's teeth clench slightly, but she accepted it because the beans were real and the thinking behind them didn't matter. The Garritys said yes immediately. Clara Garrity, 3 weeks past childbirth and still shaky on her feet, appeared at Evelyn's door one morning with a jug of milk and a look on her face that said she'd been needing to do something useful for longer than she could stand. "It's not much," Clara said, holding out the jug. Her baby was strapped against her chest in a length of flannel, small face scrunched and sleeping. "The cow's not giving like she was." "It's enough," Evelyn said, and meant it. "Come in, I'll show you what I'm doing with it." Clara came in and sat down and watched Evelyn work, and they talked for 2 hours in the easy way of women who have both recently been through something hard and recognize it in each other. The baby woke up and fussed, and Clara fed her, and Evelyn kept cooking. And when Clara finally left, she took 3 jars of broth and some of the dense fruit bread. And she also took, whether she knew it or not, the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Jonah watched this traffic through his kitchen without comment, mostly. He'd been cutting wood every day, stacking it against the side of the house in quantities that were starting to look like a serious commitment. He'd also, without being asked, made repairs to the cellar door that had been letting cold air seep through. He'd noticed the draft himself and fixed it on a Sunday morning before she was up. Small things, but she noticed. The problem with systems is that they work until they don't, and what usually breaks them is the one thing you didn't plan for. In this case, the thing Evelyn hadn't planned for was the Brennan family. The Brennans had a farm on the north edge of the county, further out than anyone else she'd been thinking about. There were 6 of them, Frank Brennan, his wife Dottie, and 4 children under 12. Wyatt knew them vaguely. They'd been to town maybe 3 times since November. A neighbor of theirs, a man named Ott, who ran a small herd of cattle on the next section, came to Doc Yates one morning with the news that he'd ridden past the Brennan place, and the smoke from their chimney was thin, and he'd knocked, and nobody had come to the door for a long time. Doc Yates told Evelyn. Evelyn told Jonah. "That's 7 miles north," Jonah said. "I know. In this weather." "I know," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll go. Ott can come with me." He was already moving toward his coat. "You stay here. Keep the kitchen going." She wanted to argue and didn't, because he was right. She couldn't leave the stove for a 7-mile ride in this weather, and there was still the daily broth to prepare, and Wyatt was coming at noon. She also knew that Jonah on horseback in bad weather was more useful than she would be. He knew the land. He left with Ott before 8 in the morning. Evelyn kept working, kept stirring, kept listening for the sound of horses. They came back in the late afternoon, just before dark, and they had Frank Brennan in the wagon and his oldest boy riding double behind Ott, and the rest of the Brennans following in their own battered buckboard that Frank's wife was driving herself with a face like stone. Frank had the fever. He'd had it for a week and hadn't said anything to anyone because the Brennans didn't ask for help, which was a philosophical position that had nearly killed him. Evelyn had beds made by the time they arrived. She'd heated water. She had broth on the stove, and she had a sense of controlled urgency that she'd learned to work in, the kind where you move fast but you don't panic because panicking doesn't heat the broth any faster. Doc Yates arrived an hour later. He looked at Frank Brennan and then at Evelyn and said, "Good timing." "Another day," she said quietly. "Maybe 2, he agreed. But yes. Dottie Brennan sat at Evelyn's kitchen table with the youngest 2 children and drank a cup of hot broth and said nothing for a very long time. She was a big-boned woman with calloused hands and a face that didn't give much away, but Evelyn could see her working through something. Finally, Dottie said, I didn't know it was this bad. In town, I mean. We've been so... We've been dealing with our own. Everyone has, Evelyn said. Frank kept saying we didn't need anyone. She said it without bitterness, but there was something exhausted underneath it. We nearly... She stopped. Started again. The children have been hungry. I've been making the beans stretch, but there's only so far they go. Evelyn set a bowl of soup in front of the youngest child, who was maybe 4, and watched the child eat it with that single-minded focus that very hungry small people have. You're here now, she said to Dottie. It was simple. It was enough. Oh. Jonah came to stand beside her that evening after the Brennan children were settled and Frank was sleeping and Doc Yates had gone home to rest and Dottie was sitting with her husband. The kitchen was quiet for the first time all day. The fire in the stove was burning low and steady. Outside the wind was picking up again, a sound like something restless moving around the edges of the house. 7 families now, Jonah said. 8, counting the Brennans. He stood beside her at the stove, not touching, just close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him from his coat, which still held the cold of the outdoors. He looked at the pot, and then at the shelf, and then at the cellar door. Evelyn, he said. She turned to look at him. He almost never used her name. When he needed her attention, he usually just started talking. She'd noticed this and had been quietly keeping count. I know, she said. The numbers, I know. He looked at her. In the low light of the kitchen, he looked older than he had when she'd first arrived, and also somehow more solid, like a man who'd been blurry around the edges and had come into focus. I'm not telling you to stop, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying stop. Then what are you saying? He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. The wind moved around the house. I'm saying I'm scared, he said. That's what I'm saying. She turned fully to face him. In 3 months, she had not heard Jonah Mercer use that word in any form, and the plainness of it now hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. I know, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. I lost someone before, because I thought what I had was enough. He said it without drama, the same way he'd said it in the cellar weeks ago. I'm not going to... I can't do that again. I won't. So I need to know that what you're planning, the thing with the pooling, I need to know it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to work, she said. I think it will. I've thought it through as carefully as I can, but I can't promise you. He held her gaze. Fair enough, he said at last. She turned back to the stove. He stayed where he was for a moment, then moved to the table and sat down with a quietness that was different from his usual quiet. It felt less like a man who had nothing to say, and more like a man who had said what he needed to say, and was now sitting with the relief of it. She stirred the pot and thought about 8 families, and a bottom getting closer, and a plan that might work or might not, and the wind kept moving around the house, looking for a way in. The thing Evelyn had understood from the beginning, and that took other people longer, was that hunger doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't arrive with a crash or a cry. It comes in quietly, in the margins, in the way a child gets slower and quieter, in the way a man who's been sick doesn't bounce back the way he should, in the way a woman keeps moving through her days, getting a little thinner, a little grayer, telling herself she's fine. By the first week of February, she could see it in faces around town that she hadn't seen it in before. Not starvation, nothing so stark, just the slow drain of people who weren't getting quite enough, stretched over weeks and months. She saw it when Wyatt came by one morning, and she noticed that his cheekbones had gotten sharper since January. She saw it in the way Harold Collins moved when he came to drop off the beans he'd promised. A stiffness that wasn't there before. A man conserving himself without knowing he was doing it. She saw it in the mirror on the mornings she looked. She was running out of time, and she knew it, and she was doing the arithmetic again, the same arithmetic, looking for a different answer. Wyatt showed up on a Thursday morning in the second week of February, later than usual, which wasn't like him. When she opened the door, he was breathing hard, his face raw with cold, and he had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something shaken behind the usual steadiness. Mrs. Mercer, he said, Doc Yates is sick. She felt the ground shift slightly under her, the way ground does when something you'd been relying on changes. How sick? She said. Bad, Wyatt said. His housekeeper found him this morning. He's got the fever and He stopped. He's not young. He kept saying last night. She looked at Wyatt's face for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. Tell me everything. He came in and sat down and told her, and she stood at the stove and listened and kept her hands busy because that was how she kept her head clear. Doc Yates, who had been the axis around which everything else turned, who had been directing patients to her kitchen and coordinating the informal network of food distribution and monitoring who was well and who was not, Doc Yates was down. Outside the window, the sky was the particular white-gray color it got before serious snow. She'd been watching it all morning. His family, she said. His wife. The children. 3 kids, Wyatt said. His wife came to get me. She doesn't know what to do. Evelyn stood at the stove for a moment with the ladle in her hand and looked at the shelf with its diminishing row of jars. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she needed to do. She thought about the conversation she needed to have with Jonah tonight, the real one, the one where she said out loud what the numbers had been telling her for 2 weeks. She put the ladle down. Fill those jars, she said to Wyatt, pointing to the clean jars on the shelf. Everything in this pot. We're going to the Yates house first, and then we're going to figure out what comes next. What has come next? Wyatt asked, getting up, reaching for the jars. Evelyn looked at the white-gray sky through the window. The snow was going to come tonight. She could feel it in the particular heaviness of the air, and it was going to be serious. She could feel that too. I'm going to ask the town for help, she said. I just need to figure out how to do it without making everyone more scared than they already are. The snow started that night, just as she'd known it would. It didn't come in gently. It came the way serious Nebraska winter comes, sideways, with wind behind it that had been building momentum across 100 miles of open plain, and by morning, the drifts against the north side of the house were 4 feet high and still climbing. The temperature dropped to something that made the air feel like it had edges, the kind of cold that gets through every gap in a wall and sits on the floor in pools, the kind that kills livestock that aren't properly sheltered and kills people who aren't careful. Jonah was up at 4 dealing with the animals. She heard him moving around the kitchen before she was fully awake, heard the barn door slam against the wind, heard it again when he got it closed. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the storm and doing what she always did in the quiet before a hard day. She made the list in her head. What needed to happen? In what order? What could wait and what couldn't? Doc Yates was sick. That was the thing at the top. She got up and dressed and built the kitchen fire back up from coals and started water heating before Jonah came back in, blowing on his fingers and trailing snow across the floor he'd swept yesterday. How bad is it? She said. Bad enough. He pulled off his outer coat and hung it by the stove to dry. Can't ride to town in this. I know. He looked at her. The Yates family. I know, she said again. She'd sent Wyatt to them yesterday with everything she could spare from the afternoon's batch. But that had been yesterday, and now there was 2 feet of fresh snow between here and town, and a doctor who was sick with the same fever he'd spent 2 months treating in other people, and his wife and 3 children in a house with whatever stores they had. She didn't say any of this out loud because Jonah already knew it, and saying it wouldn't change the snow. What she said instead was, I need to go to the cellar. He followed her down without asking why. They stood in the lamplit cold of it together, and she went through it the way she'd gone through it a dozen times, carefully, honestly, not rounding up. The jars on the shelf, the barrels, the cloth-wrapped blocks of concentrated broth, which were down to 4, the flour, which was getting low, the dried beans, which were the Collins contribution and were holding, the salt pork, which was almost gone. She said the numbers out loud as she went. Jonah stood with his arms crossed and listened. When she finished, there was a silence that had weight to it. 2 weeks, she said. Maybe a little more if I cut back further on what I'm sending out. And if you cut back, he said, people who are already weak get weaker. Yes. He uncrossed his arms and put one hand on the shelf, looking at the jars. You've been carrying this alone. It was mine to carry. It's ours, he said. It's been ours since you got here. He stopped. I should have been in this cellar with you months ago. She looked at him. His face in the lamplight was the same difficult-to-read face it always was, but she'd been learning its geography for 3 months now, and she could see the thing underneath. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated than that. A man realizing something about himself that he didn't like. You cut the wood, she said. You fixed the cellar door. You rode 7 miles in the cold to bring the Brennans in. You've been in this, Jonah, just not the part that happens in here. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, just slightly, the way he acknowledged things he couldn't argue with. What do you need? He said. I need the storm to stop, she said. And then I need to talk to the town. But the storm lasted 2 days. Not 2 days of the worst of it. The worst was the first night and into the following morning, but 2 days before the wind dropped enough that traveling was possible, and even then it was hard going. The roads were buried. The drifts had closed gaps between fences and made everything look like a different landscape, the familiar made strange by accumulation. She spent those 2 days cooking from what she had. She stretched everything she could. Bones that would have gone to the dog were boiled down to nothing and then boiled again. She made a soup from the last of the dried corn and the beans and some dried wild onion and a heel of salt pork that wasn't much more than fat and gristle. And it was not pretty, but it was warm, and it had calories in it, and that was what mattered. She sent Jonah out on the second day when the wind had dropped with 2 jars and instructions. He went without complaint, which still occasionally surprised her. He came back that afternoon with news she'd been afraid of. Yates is worse, he said. He was at the door, stamping snow off his boots, not meeting her eyes right away. His wife, Eleanor, she's holding it together, but she's scared. The oldest kid is running a low fever. The little ones are fine, but they're not eating well. What do they have for stores? Not much. Doc was out of the house so much this winter. Eleanor wasn't. She was managing the kids alone, and he paused. They're not low the way the Paulsons were low, but they've been burning through things fast with a sick man in the house. Evelyn put down the spoon she'd been holding. Eleanor Yates came to me once, back in December, before the fever started. She brought me a jar of her plum preserves as a welcome gift. She was embarrassed about it, said it was just a small thing. She paused. She didn't have to do that. I'd just arrived. Jonah was quiet. She doesn't know how bad it is with us, Evelyn said. She thinks I have plenty. She thinks I've got enough to keep feeding people indefinitely. She looked at the shelf, at the diminishing row of jars. I've let people think that because I didn't want them to be scared. But now Doc Yates is sick, and they're going to need your stores, and your stores aren't there, Jonah said. Yes. He sat down at the table. He had snow in his beard, and his hands were red from the cold, and he looked like a man who had been outside in February on the Nebraska frontier for 40 years and was not going to break under that fact. But he also looked like a man who was working through something hard. His family is asking, Jonah said. Eleanor asked me. She was careful about it. She wasn't demanding. But she asked if there was any more of the broth. She said it's the only thing Saul can keep down. There it was. The thing she'd been knowing was coming for 2 weeks, finally arriving. Eleanor Yates, who had brought her plum preserves in December. Saul Yates, who had sat at her table with his glasses off and said, it is not just cooking. 3 children, one of them already running a fever. And in her cellar, 4 blocks of concentrated broth, 2 weeks of stores for her and Jonah alone, less than that if she kept sending things out. She can have the broth, Evelyn said. Jonah looked at her. Not all of it, she said, but enough. For now. She said it clearly with conviction, because if she let herself waver, she'd talk herself out of it. We'll figure out the rest. But Saul Yates doesn't die because I was counting jars. Jonah held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, I'll take it over first thing tomorrow. She nodded and went back to the stove, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that figuring out the rest was becoming an increasingly urgent problem. She couldn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to Jonah's steady breathing and stared at the ceiling and let herself for the first time really sit with how frightened she was. It was one thing to be scared and keep moving, which she'd been doing for months. It was another thing to stop, in the quiet, and let the fear be there without immediately trying to outrun it. She'd been moving so fast, thinking so hard, staying so practical, that she hadn't let herself just feel the weight of it. She was nearly out of food. Winter wasn't over. The doctor was sick. A blizzard had just reset the town's misery counter back to 0. And she had built something. This informal, fragile, half-working network of broths and jars and a 17-year-old boy on horseback that people were now depending on. And she didn't know how to keep it alive on what was left in her cellar. She thought about the conversation she'd been building toward for days, the one she needed to have with the town, standing up in front of people and asking for help, Not abstractly, not as a pooling concept she'd explained to Wyatt in her kitchen, but actually standing there and saying, I need you. We need each other. I can't do this alone anymore. She'd helped other people her whole life. Her mother, her brothers, the neighbors in Ohio, and now these people in Nebraska she'd known less than 3 months. She knew how to give help. She was good at it. She was terrible at asking for it. Her grandmother had told her once, the hardest thing you'll ever do is let people see you with empty hands. She hadn't understood it then. She was starting to understand it now. She turned over in the dark and made herself breathe slowly, and eventually something that wasn't quite sleep came for her. The morning after the storm broke fully, a thin, pale sun came out, and the world looked scoured and exhausted, everything white and still and very cold. Evelyn was up before Jonah, which was unusual, and she had the kitchen fire going and water heating when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard. She opened the door and found Wyatt Collins, on his horse, with his hat pulled down and his scarf wrapped up, and an expression on what was visible of his face that she couldn't read. What happened? She said. He got down from the horse and came to the door. I went to check on people this morning, soon as I could get through. He came inside and stood dripping on the floor, and she handed him a cup of something hot without even thinking about it. The Paulson family's all right. Brennan's got through okay. Frank's still weak, but he's up. Alderman, the school teacher, he's sick again. Not as bad as before, but it's back. She put her hand on the table. The Yates household. I went there first, he said. Eleanor let me in. Souls, he's not good, Mrs. Mercer. The fever broke overnight, but he's very weak. She said he can barely lift his head. He needs the broth. Jonah's taking it this morning. I know, she told me to tell you. He stopped, and she could see him working out how to phrase something. She said to tell you she understands if you can't. She didn't want... He looked down at his cup. She was crying when she said it. She was trying not to let it show. Evelyn stood at the table and felt the whole weight of it settle on her at once. Not dramatically. There was no moment of crisis, no breaking point she could name. It was more like the slow accumulation finally reached the level where she could feel it against her chest when she breathed. She thought about Eleanor Yates crying and trying not to show it. She thought about Frank Brennan, who didn't ask for help and nearly died for it. She thought about Margaret Halbrook, 72 years old, and sitting alone in her house for 2 months because nobody came to tell her things were bad. She thought about what she'd said to Wyatt weeks ago. You don't get a town by just living next to people. You get a town by going through something with them. She'd been going through this with them, but she'd been doing it quietly, from her kitchen, sending things out through Wyatt like messages in bottles, never showing her face or her empty hands. She'd been present in their homes through her soup, but not present herself. And now she was out of soup. Wyatt, she said. Yes, ma'am. Is there a gathering place in town, somewhere people come together? He looked up. The feed store, mostly. Hartley lets people use the back when it's cold. That's where the town meetings happen. Can you get word to people?